This lecture will cover print, early knowledge, and emerging interest.
What's notable about Chapter 16 is that we really start talking about how preschool children are writers. And of course, this is interesting because we don't always think of ourselves as teachers of writers at this age, but in fact we are. And we know from the earlier chapters where we talked about the importance of storytelling and poetry that this is particularly meaningful for young children. In order to understand what children are going to need to do in order to move forward and prepare for writing, we need to understand small muscle development, understand our sequence of skills for written language, understand the kinds of settings that we can develop in our early learning areas that promote the development of print, and we need to be adept at planning print awareness activities. Some important understandings that young children develop as they're moving into this phase is they really, based on their early experiences with print, start to form a foundation for literacy. So one of the first things that happens is they start to really be aware that print is different from other visual symbols. So in other words, they can separate it from, let's say, random scribbling or other types of drawing. Children start to understand that print symbolizes language, that if they can figure out how to make those squiggly marks, that they'll be producing language. And they understand that print can be produced by anyone, so they start to become motivated to want to write themselves, and that print holds information. Now, some of the reading skill that's gained from the read aloud process happens in this manner. Children start to notice where reading starts on a page. They start to develop left to right orientation and return to the left margin at the end of a line. And then they start to notice that pages actually are sequenced in such a manner that they begin with page 1. Now this is, again, what we would call print awareness, where we start to understand our growing recognition of the conventions and characteristics of a written language, which would include, for example, that left to right orientation. Also, children start to notice that there's a difference between a letter, a word, and a sentence, that those are all very different things. And children notice that there are spaces between words. Again, these are all parts of our print awareness and our understanding of the conventions. They understand that special marks, such as punctuation, also have meaning, and that there are upper and lowercase letters. Of course, it's all connected. So as we talk about writing, we have to remember the things that we know about reading and about listening and speaking and viewing, because all of these things are connected to one another, and all of these things deeply and profoundly impact our capacity to learn literacy. It's important to be familiar with the developmental levels of writing, and this is, of course, talked about in your book. Now, at the first level of writing, this is when children are starting to distinguish between drawing and writing. Children start to realize that curved and straight lines are organized differently in writing, that print is linear, it's not all over the page, it has a pattern to it. That children start to look at acceptable traditional letter forms. They start to understand the idea of how an A has a certain shape and how it differs greatly from the shape of, let's say, an H. Children start to recognize written marks as substitute objects. So in other words, they start to understand that the meaning that's conveyed in a note is representative of something else. Now at the second level, children look for differences in strings of print. They don't yet understand their sound and symbol relationship, but they are starting to put some of this together. At the third level, children develop the awareness that there's a certain string of letters that forms their name. So they start to realize that certain distinguishable marks make up a person's name. The child starts to learn the names of some letters. Scribbles start to become a little bit more like print. So we start printing letter forms as words are heard and looking for similar letters to write similar sounds and understanding that letters do, in fact, represent sounds. So again, we start to form print-like scribbles in our sequence of written language, and then our scribbles become linear. And then we start forming these closed shapes and purposeful lines, and then our letter-like forms. Then we make recognizable alphabet letters. After that, we form alphabet groupings with spaces and begin our invented spelling. And then we spell words correctly with appropriate spaces after that. Invented spelling is the result of an attempt to spell a word where the spelling is not already known. So children start to move through this process where they'll spell cat, KT, because they hear the beginning sound and the end sound, but they're not totally sure how that comes together. This is a developmental phase, and it's perfectly fine. It's nothing to be alarmed about. Sometimes parents get very worried and they think, oh no, my child can't spell. But it's just developmental as children are starting to form those relationships. The stages of invented spelling are as follows. First, there's spelling awareness. This is where we just realize, well, alphabet letters represent words. And primitive spelling is where we spell with no real relationship between the spelling and the word. So for example, you'll ask a child to write the word cat, and they'll write, H, B, T, B, L, F. It's just strings of letters. They really have no understanding of that. And then the prephonetic spelling, this is where the initial and final consonants might become correct. So KT for cat would be an example of that prephonetic spelling. Then phonetic spelling is almost a perfect match between symbols and sounds. So we use some vowels. So for example, spelling L-I-K for like would be an example of phonetic spelling. And then correct spelling, of course, is after that. Children generally do move to more traditional spelling with practice. Sometimes early on, children even think that letters have a relationship to how the word's pronounced, so they'll write the word elephant in huge letters. It's just all, again, part of developmental approaches. And what we do when children have invented spelling is we can write the correct word above or below the child's spelling, but we should not cross it out or have particularly rigid spelling rules anyway during emerging writing, because that can be very frustrating for a child. Some key definitions that you should be aware of have to do with sight reading and alphabetic principle. Now, sight reading is recognizing whole words before you know letters, or recognizing a word before you sound it out. So, for example, knowing our name, that's an example of sight reading. And sometimes children will, let's say, learn the names of good friends even before they've really understood, well, J makes a J sound, and that's why so-and-so's name, Jim, for example. So before they understand, well, Jim is spelled J-I-M because J makes a J sound and M makes a M sound. They just know, oh, well, I've seen my friend Jim's name written so many times. That's how you spell Jim. So that's kind of typical. A lot of times preschool children will recognize their friends' names, and that's sight reading. And then alphabetic principle is where you understand that spoken language can be analyzed as a string of separate words and as sequences of syllables and phonemes within syllables. So, in other words, we're really just understanding that our spoken language has separate words in it, and that within those words we've got these sequences of syllables, and that within those syllables we've got these phonemes that are actually making up the word. So alphabetic principle could also be thought of as an understanding that there's a code, and you see what the pattern of the code is, and you understand that the alphabet is the foundation of that code. In order to understand children's writing, we also need to be aware of where they're at in terms of their physical development. Really, in order to grow and develop and be ready for writing, we have to have good, strong muscle control. And our muscle control depends on our diet, our exercise, how much we're using those skills. Some children in preschool or in kindergarten are not particularly adept at cutting, and if they haven't had a lot of practice at that kind of a fine motor task, then it makes sense. They just haven't exercised those fingers to really be practicing that skill. But over time, of course, they can develop that. Inherited ability is an issue also. Sometimes we'll say to parents that we see fine motor issues, and parents will say, oh, that happened to me when I was a child. There is something heritable about that too. And then some children are not particularly motivated to do such an activity because the activities in front of them do not seem interesting to them. So we have to challenge ourselves. We do know that that all children can be motivated. We just have to create interesting enough activities, find what their interest areas are, and motivate them in that way, because our young children that we're talking about this semester are far too young to be given any kind of temperamental characteristic like essentially unmotivated. That would not apply for a young child. Again, we just have to make our activities enticing. There are 7 prerequisite skills for handwriting that are talked about in this chapter, and they're listed here. Small muscle development and coordination, which we talked about in the previous slide. Eye-hand coordination is very important. Ability to hold a writing tool properly. Sometimes children have to unlearn the holding habits that they've already learned. Ability to form basic strokes, just in terms of a physical skill. Letter perception. Children need to be able to perceive what the letter is in order to reproduce it with a pencil. Orientation to printed language. We have to really be able to find those words on the page and be looking for them, be expecting them. And then left to right understanding. This can be very challenging, particularly for some English language learners that may come from another place where they have always seen adults modeling reading right to left, for example. So it's very difficult to learn a different, to learn left to right if you've been reading right to left. And I know because I took language classes where I had to learn to read right to left, and it was extremely difficult. I can only imagine how hard that would be for a young child. Now, other impacts on writing have to do with drawing experience. There's a profound connection between experience and ability in drawing and interest in and ability to write. We find this in the research that for some reason, presumably for all of the things that we've talked about, just in terms of being comfortable with writing utensils and being oriented to a page and space on a page and practice and motor skills, that children who develop early on an interest in drawing, they develop an ability to write more easily and more quickly. Part of it is that drawings and paintings communicate children's thinking, which ties back to what we talked about in terms of learning to become an author, learning to produce literature. And children, when they create something artistic, they like to talk about it, and they create stories to accompany their graphics, so it fosters storytelling. So all of this art time that we like to give our children, it's really not just art. It's also something that promotes writing in a way that is profound. In terms of exposure to books, that is, again, something that we find in the research, that when children are exposed to many books, it helps to foster their pencil and paper literacy. And scribbling and doodling is another element, and that seems to also be connected to exposure to books. Different types of books, such as the ones that you have been examining on the blackboard this semester, definitely help to increase writing awareness. Other things in terms of the environment that we have to consider for the environment for the impact on writing. We have to think about handedness. Most left-handers, interestingly, use their right hands more often than right-handers ever use their lefts. Writing surfaces in preschools have to accommodate all children. You really need to be aware of the handedness issue. You have to have right-handed and left-handed scissors. Of course, we would never change hand preference, as might have happened 50 or 100 years ago. But be cognizant of your left-handers by seating them at the end of tables, or that they're not crowded up against right-handers, because it's hard to learn to write, and you need a vast amount of space a lot of things need to go right, not right as in right-handed, but need to go well in order to truly learn to write. So that's very important. And then having other literacy materials, just lots and lots of magnets, puzzles, letter shapes that children can kind of touch and feel, electronic interactive kinds of games, like the leapfrog games, even the kinds of things that you'd normally put on a refrigerator that you could put on a magnet board in your classroom. Those types of things are very helpful. And of course, song is, as we know, very important for learning literacy, and it is connected to writing. So in the end, where does this leave us? As teachers, what we really want to know is, what about teaching the ABCs? Can I still teach my ABCs? What's the best approach? Is it the is it the traditional approach or the readiness approach? The bottom line is you absolutely can and should introduce the ABCs, particularly in light of what we know about kindergarten readiness, and really knowing that children do need to know their letter names upon kindergarten entry. But just make it developmentally appropriate. There should be no worksheets. Children should have the opportunity to do things that are hands-on and interactive. You definitely want to keep it based in meaning. So teachers should mention connections to other curricular areas so children can understand how writing fits into the whole of communicating. Remember, we're not just writing because it's required by school. We write because it's a life skill, and it helps us to understand more about bats if we're interested in bats, or it helps us to understand more about dragons if we're interested in dragons. So letters need to be made relevant to the child's world. And we use environmental print for that. We point out exit signs. We point out things that are written on the menu in our pretend play area, because that's a life skill that most children will encounter even early on in life. We provide a variety of materials, a print-rich environment, and our ultimate goal is that we want children to learn to recognize and print every lowercase and uppercase letter in excellent form.